But now let's move on to other international and financial news. We asked this crucial question: as Donald Trump's tariffs rattle global markets and shift investor flows, can Africa and the wider global south seize this moment to build stronger, fairer economies? So to help unpack this, we're joined now by political economist Dr. Dale McKinley, whose work examines Africa's role in global trade and finance. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Dr. McKinley. First, your insights on what we've seen. We've seen U.S. job markets come out. We've seen various commentators speak about the impact on the American economy of these tariffs hikes, and of course we've also seen the court challenges against these presidential executive orders.
Yes, good evening, Chipiso, and to your viewers and listeners. So I mean, there's been a lot, as you mentioned, there's been a lot more attention paid to the U.S. side of these impacts, and I think obviously here in South Africa we've talked about particular sectors that have been affected, like agriculture, industries, and so forth. But on an Africa-wide basis, I think in many ways, what this does represent are some opportunities. Yes, there's going to be some headwinds, that's for sure. Particular countries where there's mono economies, where there is reliance on one or two exports that might be particularly vulnerable to some of these tariffs. But generally speaking, I think the positive, potentially more positive, longer term impact of this is that it's going to force African countries to look elsewhere. It's going to force them to look inward. And I mean inward, I mean continentally and regionally, and it's going to push other countries such as in Asia, India, the BRICS countries, and others into, whether they want to or not necessarily, into potentially more kinds of talks around different trade deals, opening up different kinds of markets, because the United States is basically, and what Trump's fundamental sort of agenda is to basically isolate the United States from the global trade regime in some ways, and that opens up a lot of opportunities, I think, for our continent. And I think they are in some ways, as some commentators have said, they are in some ways quite historic, because this hasn't really presented itself much in this way as in the post-World War II era.
So the view is that the role of tariffs is either protection or leverage. What are we actually seeing happen in the United States in terms of the reality? But also, is South Africa and the rest of Africa written into this new story? Do they have leverage, as you've mentioned, or do we face the challenge of the so-called old commodity trap? The commodities are doing well, but what about the rest of our economies?
Yeah, so just for the first part of that question, I think in many ways Trump is learning some hard lessons, and in that way, because his entire basis for these was to basically protect U.S. industry, get manufacturing and others back into the United States, create more jobs, and it hasn't happened, at least so far, and I don't think it's going to really happen. In fact, I think what he's learning is that in the sense of these tariffs, because the United States in the last 60 years has been so integrated and such a hegemon within the global trade industry, to just all of a sudden expect within a few months, because you put some tariffs up, that you're going to be able to turn that ship around, I think is very naive. So in that sense, it's a lot more complicated. And what that does is, again, in this case, it does open up some leverage for countries that have the things that the United States wants and that the world still needs. So let's take, for example, I've mentioned this, let's take our agricultural and our citrus products. Most countries want South African products on the citrus and agriculture. We have a very good reputation for quality produce. So we have relied on U.S. markets to some extent, but there are many others that are there. So we can leverage that and create new. It's going to take some time, but if there's a proper plan, the same would go for other potential sectors. But it's going to take a government that has a plan, has a longer term. And this is where the weak point is in South Africa, because this government has continued to rely on the energies minerals complex to drive the export economy and to drive essentially, the currency, reserve currencies and other things that would allow us to have some kind of more strategic place within the global economy. This is an opportunity to expand. We're going to fail that test if the government doesn't work with the private sector and with organizations to basically increase our economic capacity in the industrial sector, within other kinds of areas. And this is only going to happen when we begin new trade relationships. So there are many possibilities, there are many potential roadblocks and barriers, but in this case we do have potential leverage. But if we don't act properly and we don't have a long-term plan, then it could backfire on us.
So let's talk about capital flows and where they are headed just on the African continent, also taking into account the various economic regional blocks and their disparate strategies, because I believe that we're seeing different dynamics here, that in Kenya, its tech sector is attracting global capital. Nigeria is debating oil subsidy reform. Ethiopia is trying to position itself as a low-cost manufacturing hub. Can we, as a united continent, be able to ward off this dependency and ensure that it works for Africa as a whole and beyond national interests, individual country national interests?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's been a question that we've been asking ourselves for a long time, irrespective of these latest Trump maneuvers, which is, can countries overcome these both regional as well as nationalistic divides, and create some sort of, at least in this case, economic unity? One wouldn't expect necessarily on the political front that too much on that front. And right now, it's a mixed bag. What we see is one sector of Africa pulling in one way, one in the other. And here's the potential downside to not creating, through the AU, through the African Development Bank, through the regional and other kinds of economic trade areas. If we don't take advantage of that, then what's going to happen is not only the United States, but China, India, and many of the other countries are going to pick us off. What they're going to do is they're going to cut bilateral deals that serve their national interests, and leaving out a more regional and continental perspective. So it's up to us as African continent to get our act together. And that means to stop this bickering, stop this nationalistic tendencies on the economic front, and realize that if we're going to have these potentials, we talk about the demographic dividend, the youthfulness, the potential growth in our continent. But in order to take advantage of that, we need some kind of economic, regional, and continental plan, and not total unity, but degrees of commonality. If that doesn't happen, what we're going to do is we're going to fall back into this sort of bilateral division of nationalistic tendencies, and we're going to lose this opportunity.
And I want to just then, based on what you're saying, and I'm looking at South Africa's presidency of the G20, the upcoming G20, and its theme for this year, it's solidarity, equality, sustainability. And we would drill down to it, it's about social justice. How are we going to manage this when we do a comparative study of Africa as a region, but also other emerging markets? If we're looking at South Africa within the BRICS, where other African countries are not a part of, how are we going to make sure that, as you say, all of those disparate interests work in tandem for the larger global South?
Yeah, it's not an easy task, is it? I mean, it's something that we've been struggling with in the post-independence era across our continent. And I mean, there have been some positive developments, but fundamentally it boils down to, as we've mentioned here in our own country, political will to act. And looking beyond one sort of more narrow, particular, class interest in the terms of a national sort of capitalist class, or trading in particular commodities, and moving beyond that. And so far, many African countries and many leadership have not shown that kind of vision. If we often talk about the Asian experience and how they've done very well over the last 20 or 30 years in growing, diversifying their economy, not only in the export but in the domestic front. That was as a result of planning, is a result of a particular national developmental strategy. That's what's lacking in most of our African countries, is that kind of strategy. We don't lack the capacity, we don't lack the brains, we don't lack the potential, we simply lack the political will to move in that regard, because we're oftentimes bickering with sort of more narrow interests. There's no silver bullet here, Chapiso, in terms of what's going to solve this. But I think fundamentally what's happening across the world is that ordinary people, citizens themselves, those that really run the economy, really make it work, are beginning to realize that we cannot just simply leave things up to those people, the politicians, the expert classes, the economists, and everything else. And in that sense, we're also, this is an experiment in democracy, widening that in economic democracy in this case, and widening that specter. So I think it's going to be a rocky road. It's going to be a whole range of ups and downs, but I don't think we're going to go backwards. Africa has been in the doldrums for quite a long time, and I think it's our time in these next 20 or 30 years. The question is, are we going to have the courage as a people and as a citizenry to grasp that and not to simply rely on old shibboleths and old leadership and looking for saviors or looking for someone from the outside to come and make things happen for us.
As you drill it down to the people, Dale, let's end on that note. Beyond the policy reforms and the financial global infrastructure, what does it mean for the people on the ground if we're talking a new reindustrialization plan? Is it going to put better pay on the table? Is it going to mean improved livelihoods? Does it mean that, for instance, these sovereign wealth funds that people believe their monies are being invested in to improve their future, are they really going to come to fruition beyond, the jargon and the economic speak?
Yeah, again, no easy answer to that question, but in many ways, I think we're heading in a more positive. It might seem counterintuitive given the headwinds that we're traveling through, the rise of narrow nationalisms and xenophobia and all sorts of other things that we see across the world and retreating into sort of lagers. But I think in our continent, in many cases, what we have the potential to do is to do what we. If we look back at that immediate post-independence era in many African countries, there was this real desire to have a developmental agenda, to create a global South sort of counterweight and a continental counterweight, to say we're different than the West, we're different than other countries. We want to try to make things the basics of life. We want to try to build those foundations. We abandoned that vision, and I think it's coming back in many ways. The realization that it's not about catching up to the West. It's not about mimicking the West. It's about developing our own developmental path. And I think many African, and particularly the younger generation, are equipped to do this in many ways better than the older generations are. So there's lots of potentialities. The question is can we harness that in a way, an organized way at a national level that goes beyond simply just, your regular political parties, your big men politics and everything else, and your traditional interests, and begins to create economies of scale, not only at the national but the regional level, that sort of break down these traditional barriers that we've had, both culturally, linguistically, and nationally. And I think so. It's in some ways it's a revolution of economic, social, and other things in a gradual way that presents those possibilities. I am optimistic in the longer term that we can do this. Because I don't think that I think the alternatives, and particularly for the younger generation, understand the alternatives are simply not acceptable.
All right, Dale, thank you so much. Always good to talk to you. Dr. Dale McKinley, political economist, just speaking to us about the U.S. impact, the tariffs imposition on particularly Africa and what it means for emerging markets, but particularly for those on the ground who are hoping that we are not written out of the story, that we can benefit from this new conversation. And it brings us to a minute to 10. Let's find out what to expect from African Diaries this evening. Shane and Kumana in studio. Hi.